Welcome to the Ghost Show online, my fiends, booze, and ghouls. Your hosts, Seika Groves, Rachel Benter, and Ian Russell will discuss all things paranormal. Prepare to be afraid.
So today's show, we're chatting about paranormal activity at monolithic sites, megaliths, whatever you want to call them, ancient sites. And yeah, so I know Rachel wanted to talk about Stonehenge, and we'll touch on that. But for the most part, yeah, I've got a couple of things, but do you want to kind of run off the top of the show, Ian? Because I know you sort of wanted to chit-chat in general. So let's chit-chat in general.
Yeah, okay. So I don't really have any specific location in terms of paranormal hauntings. Basically, because I couldn't literally find any out there. There was one instance that I found one. There was a YouTube video, and some chap had gone into one of the locations in England.
Okay.
Was it Avebury?
Avebury?
Yeah, it could have been that. It was a round.
Yes, the stones of Avebury.
Round stones, and he went in with dowsing rods.
Okay.
Which is an old school paranormal detection method. And he walked into the circle, the rods crossed, he backed up, they went straight out again. But as I say, I can't really find any evidence out there of specific hauntings related to any of these locations.
Right.
So I'm just going to have to go off my own opinion as a paranormal investigator as to why, if there are hauntings on these sites, as to why it is.
Right, and that's the thing too, right? Is it really hauntings, or is it more what we would consider paranormal activity in terms of unusual and strange things happening? So not necessarily, running into a spirit, but just, some of the odd things. And I'm gonna use this as a bridge, a tie-in, only because it's out there and people know about it. So let's talk about Outlander, the show, right? The premise of Outlander, where Claire, goes up to the stones and she touches the stones and they become a portal, and she's whisked back in time to the, sort of 1730s, I think is when it is. Now, I'm always curious about, obviously it's a story and it's written and it's for entertainment. But if this were to happen, what time period would you end up going back to? Because is it something to do with your own past ancestral history? Is there a tie? Like in her case, there's a tie to her modern day husband's direct family. So there's this tie-in for her with that. Because in her modern life, they're kind of doing a bit of a genealogy thing, and her husband is finding out about, who he is and his ancestors, etc. So, interesting premise. There are stones on Eilean Lewis, right, or the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, which are not, the stones, by the way, in Outlander don't exist. Like, there's no stones called what they are in Outlander, but the site that they went to is an actual site. It's just not that name. But on the Isle of Lewis, there are stones called the Callanish stones. And those stones, if I get the name correct, I think in Gaelic is Fir, which means, I think it's something along the lines of either standing giants or something to do with men. And I can't, in my head right now, I'm trying to do the translation. It's kind of a weird translation that it translates to. Sort of to me, the words don't actually translate to sort of the false men, I guess, is more the translation. But to me, neither of those actual words in Gaelic really translate to that. So it's sort of a weird one of those. It doesn't really translate directly into English. But these stones are pretty old. Like they go back a good 2900 to 2600 BC. So we're talking, you know, sort of pre-Iron Age, you know, it's more Bronze Age-ish, I guess, if we're going to go, you know, on that route. The standing stones are very similar to the ones that you would see on Outlander, but they're not in the woods, right? They're sort of out on a Scottish moor on the Isle of Lewis. So these stones being this old, again, it's sort of the concept, what we're trying to attach to these stones, because I think for the most part, really, in terms of myself as an archaeologist, having seen some sites like Avebury and a number of other sites, it's really hard to figure out exactly what was going on. You know, the mindset. I mean, obviously there's a purpose, but I think we're sort of guesstimating what's happening with these sites at the best of times. So this site is very much the same thing. It's a ring of stones. It's not like Stonehenge. It never had a top on it. It's more like Avebury. It's more like the stones in Outlander. But they do have some lining up points. They do have some alignment points. The midsummer full moon apparently is a good one for these stones. The Callanish stones are quite big. They're quite tall, and they've been there a really long time. But again, it's one of those things where, you know, we're sort of guessing what they were used for. You know, early culture, early society, obviously would have had places of worship, much like we do today. So perhaps these are those sites. They're gathering sites. They're places to, you know, perform a ritual per se, for a certain time of year or whatever, you know, those occasions may be. And I feel the same way with Stonehenge. Stonehenge is starting to really give us a much bigger picture as we go, as things, you know, that we're able to use now, like ground penetrating radar and all of these modern technologies that are allowing us to now really see Stonehenge as a much more comprehensive site. But Lewis, again, this site is really interesting. But I think that with this site, it may have been a major site that the Vikings also used at the time, because it had already existed. And they settled on the Isle of Lewis and the Outer Hebrides and the Orkneys and the Shetlands. And so they may have even looked at these stones in a way that perhaps they were using them for their own significant, you know, celebrations or rituals or gatherings, or however you want to label that. So these stones are very interesting. They're very old. They've been there. Like I say, the Viking community likely used them as well. But the one thing that's really interesting with these ones is there is a story of an apparition. But it's got an interesting sort of thing. They also say that there's a cow that appears in this and around this circle. Usually at times when people were hungry. So during the cold season, the winter time, if you've never been to the Outer Hebrides, they're very windy. And while they don't get a lot of snow in the wintertime, food is pretty scarce unless you can fish it out of the ocean or you're raising some kind of livestock. So there were those stories, and this, this sparkling apparition. Now, it doesn't really get into saying whether the apparition appears to be a male, a female, but, so we've got what appears to be a human apparition and a cow apparition at this site. So kind of an interesting story there. A number of people have gone to Callanish and done investigations. So that was the one thing that I did like about this. There are some actual paranormal, evidence. So one of these was they had asked what the stones were used for. So they actually said, can you tell me what the stones were used for? Now, what I find interesting is, and we've talked about this before, that you're going to do this investigation, but the problem is you're asking these questions in English. These people did not speak English.
Right.
Not English that we speak today. They probably didn't even speak what we know as Scottish Gaelic today. They would have spoke a much older language, perhaps one of the old Pictish languages or the old Scotty languages. And while we do get Gaelic from these languages, it would not even be what we know as Scottish Gaelic today. So I always find it odd when people go, and I got this response. And of course, it's in English. And it's like, yeah, how did that happen?
Exactly.
It's great that people go there and they do these things and they get these responses and they use an obelisk or they use a spirit box. But I'm always so skeptical of getting an answer in English when this is not a language that these people would have spoken. So of the paranormal evidence that I read through for Callanish stones, I'm really just going to say until I'm there and I can do my own walkthrough that
Exactly.
I don't know. I just don't feel like answering in English, right? So for me, the obelisk is a fantastic tool and I enjoy playing and tinkering with it. But it also, depending on which model you have, has between 3,500 and 7,000 words already in the box, and it constantly cycles. So, you got to kind of take it with the with a grain of salt there. I mean, if it started talking to me in some old Gaelic tongue, then I might be impressed. Right? But if it's spitting out words like people and those kinds of things, to me, the box is just doing its cycling at that point. And again,
Well, there's where you need to use a spirit box as opposed to an obelisk.
Yes, exactly.
Because the database in the obelisk is programmed English.
Yes, it is programmed in English. Exactly. So it's really tough to kind of get something. So I want to read through this dialogue that came, and I'm not saying yes or no. I'm not even going to identify which paranormal group this is or who it was that did this, but I want to read through the dialogue because you tell me what you think when we read through the dialogue. So we had about a minute and a bit into this paranormal investigation. It says, I'm in hell. And then, can you see us? Then the person asks if you can tell me what these stones were used for. And then it says, people. And then the paranormal investigator says, I ask what mysterious things here happened. And then the word decisions comes up. And then a strange voice and tones. I ask again, is this stone a portal? No, this is. And then there's nothing. And then it says, you're finally back in And then I asked, and it says, some things have changed. And I asked what changed. It says, do tell. And then I got connections at this site, and the answer is gatherings. I think so. And then it says pain, and then it says your choice.
Some of it appears to make sense. That could just be coincidence, because as you say, there wouldn't be English.
Right, there wouldn't be English.
So I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, and again, using an ovilus and the ovilus, it really does spit words out. And if you want to try and string them together to make sense, you certainly can. I mean, I've been in situations where I've asked a question and it'll come out with something like, I hate you. Right. And it's, it's
no, that's why in a situation like that, you've got to use a spirit box.
I think so too. And then you would hopefully get the language. Now, interpreting that language, good luck. It's it's pretty much a dead language at this point in time. But if it's coming through as something other than English, and perhaps even an old form of Gaelic or Pictish or whatever it may be, some Germanic-based language, then I'm going to go, okay, there might be something here. But, when you get in, I'm in hell off of the first, bang on the ovulus, I have a problem with that because, first of all, 2,600 years ago, these people had no clue about Christianity. And hell was not something that existed for the most part, that word especially, outside of, and even in Christianity, hell is not hell because it was written in Latin or it was written in Greek or it was written in Hebrew or that. So we don't say that. That is actually an old Nordic word. Hell. It is what it is, right? It describes and a god in Norse mythology or Norse beliefs. And so I have an issue with that right off the top because we're plugging into something. Now, could this perhaps be someone who frequented the stones at a much later date and perhaps remained there in spirit?
Possible.
Possible. But the Isle of Lewis is predominantly Scottish Gaelic speaking people. Predominantly. They still speak it today. So I still have an issue with that.
It's hard to know without verifying exactly what energy you are specifically speaking with.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It could be something that you've brought with you.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm always a little bit skeptical when we start getting English at sites that I think we are pretty sure would not be speaking English anytime, even up until perhaps the 1800s. And like I said, the Isle of Lewis is still predominantly a Gaelic speaking district in Scotland. The Outer Hebrides in general still speak Scottish Gaelic for the most part.
I know of an investigation that took place somewhere in Italy. And what the investigation team did is they got an Italian person to ask the questions.
Yes.
And then what they did was they recorded EVPs for their investigation.
To get the answers.
Mm-hmm. And they did get answers. And yes, they were in Italian. And they had to get a translator to tell them what these EVPs were. But
makes sense to me. I've done readings for people, and I've had a couple of times where somebody's, people's people will come through. And one woman in particular, the entire time, the spirit was speaking in Spanish to me. I don't speak Spanish, so I'm just literally regurgitating what I'm being told. And the woman sitting across from me knows exactly what's being said, and she knows who's saying it. I don't speak Spanish. I don't begin to pretend I speak Spanish. So, but that's how I'm hearing it. Or when I'm on Indigenous sites and something comes through, it's always in the language of those Indigenous people. It's not in English. I don't get it in English, right? When I was in China, I had stuff in Chinese, nothing in English. So, I mean, that's sort of the thing. So if you are doing, you got to kind of think about these things, it just makes sense to me that you would want to even have somebody there on the Isle of Lewis who speaks Gaelic, fluent Gaelic, because then at least you might get a better understanding if there's a response, right? And interesting place, really beautiful site. I'm planning to get to the Outer Hebrides sometime in the who knows when this stupid pandemic is over. I want to do some work with some of the local archaeological community there and the Iron Age wheelhouses that are quite prevalent still in the Outer Hebrides. So I will get to this site when I get there. Follow up. Who knows when that'll be, but yeah, those things. But so let's touch on Stonehenge then, just because we can, because it's probably the most famous.
Well, indeed. Yeah.
Monolithic site in the world in terms of the European world. And I didn't really do a whole lot of research on, what might come up. So I'm just going to use our good old friend Google, and let's just see what comes.
Well, I know with Stonehenge, is it haunted? Is it not? Let's say it is.
Right.
Why would that be? Well, just recently I've been reading that they're constructing some kind of a bypass for one of the motorways.
I don't know why.
Right next to Stonehenge, and there's going to be this a tunnel that goes underneath the area, and
that really bothers me a lot.
That they've started on this. Of course, they've had to do archaeological digs before they start the construction, and they've actually uncovered skeletons.
Yes,
that are buried within that Stonehenge area, and so you've got to think, okay, well, there could be one reason right there that Stonehenge could possibly be haunted, is you have burials in the vicinity.
Right. Yes. Well, yeah, and that's what I was saying about Stonehenge, because it has, with this ability with ground penetrating radar and all of these other things now, we know that Stonehenge is actually huge. There's about a 2-kilometer radius around Stonehenge that's still, attached. There was a village and there was a burial site and there was all of these other things. So, we're starting to see that. And I'm really confused by this highway bypass being put in, because there's already a highway on the other side of it. So I'm just so confused by how this even is allowed.
Oh, I know there's a lot of opposition to it, but unfortunately it's going ahead. But
well, money talks, right?
Yep.
And that's the unfortunate thing. But Stonehenge. I mean, Stonehenge is such a profoundly elaborate site, and Wiltshire itself, the entire surrounding areas of Wiltshire are, they're just some of the most reported haunted areas in the UK. My father, my stepdad, grew up in Devon, and so between Exeter and essentially Wiltshire, and he wrote a book on all kinds of the old folklore paranormal happenings. And it's a really interesting book, and I'm going to plug my dad's book because it's called The Ballerbane. And it's kind of a gothic horror novel, but it has a lot to do with the tie-ins of the old, paranormal folk stories that surround the area. So there's a lot of paranormal activity that goes on in the Wiltshire area. And so I'm not surprised that Stonehenge would be sort of a hotbed of activity in terms of, not just going back to, 9,000 years ago, which is when we kind of believe that Stonehenge was first erected, was about 9,000 years ago. But also into, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century, this site was used by other people as well. So until it became designated as a National Historic Site and a sort of tourist destination, I'm sure this site was used over the years for many, many different things, right? Good, bad, and indifferent, perhaps. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of energy surrounding Stonehenge. It's been a tourist attraction for hundreds of years already.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, people were coming there in the 1700s to look at Stonehenge. So. There's no doubt that there is some activity there, and because I think it's a different site than something like Avebury or even the Callanish stones. While they found the one body inside the circle of Callanish, I'm not sure at this point if Avebury has had any, burials associated with it or anything. There's stories that go with it. There's the, sacrifice stories and all these kinds of things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I believe a lot of those stories, but, Bronze Age and Iron Age man did a lot of sacrifice.
Oh, yes, they did. That's right.
They did a lot of human sacrifice. It was, much like going back to the Inca or the Aztec or the Mayan. Blood ceremonies were very important, and or sacrificing, and even old Nordic, in some of the old Nordic rituals, there is mention of human sacrifice. A lot of it gets overblown, but we know by bog mummies, for the most part, a good portion of bog mummies that have been found in the UK and in Scandinavia as well were sacrificial victims. At least that's what we believe. When you have a ligature around the neck, or the neck has been cut and the hands have been tied behind the back and they've been deposited into the bog for a reason, right? You're not just ditching a murder victim, right? This is not, that we see over and over again the connection between the sacrificial style and the depositing of bodies into the bogs. So that being said, I'm sure that some of these sites may have also served as, locations where some of this could have taken place. So if that's the case, then yes, certainly there could be paranormal activity there.
Yeah, I don't doubt it.
Yeah, just from those procedures and those things that may have gone on. Will we ever know for sure?
Probably not.
Not.
Thank you for watching The Ghost Show Online. Join your hosts again next week as they discuss more tales of the supernatural, the paranormal, and all things spectacular. See you soon.